This is another show from the Mamma Mia Podcast Network, the #1 women's podcast network in the world.
Just a warning before we get started, this podcast deals with adult issues, including issues of suicide. If you or a loved one is struggling with mental health, we urge you to please contact Lifeline on 131114. Welcome to No Filter. I'm Mia Friedman. On the 7th of July, 2012, the shape of Kathy Kelly's family changed forever. It was Saturday night, and the mother of three was at home with her husband Ralph when they received a phone call that can only be described as every parent's worst nightmare. Their 18-year-old son Thomas had been the victim of a coward punch in Sydney's King's Cross just after 10 p.m. He never regained consciousness, and 2 days later, he was dead.
But I think I knew the moment I saw him that he was already gone.
Kathy and her husband Ralph didn't want what happened to them to happen to another family. They wanted to make a difference. So they rallied for lockout laws in Sydney and set up safe spaces around the city on weekends to help young people. They got on with things and tried to make the best out of the brutal hand they'd been dealt. But then last year, unimaginably, a second tragedy struck. Their youngest son, Stuart, took his own life. He was 18 and only a few days older than his older brother Thomas had been when he died just a few years earlier. Just let that sink in for a moment. I remember when I first heard that Stuart had taken his life. My reaction and so many people's reaction was just one of abject horror and shock and devastation for that family, as if they hadn't suffered enough. So how do you get on with things? How do you bury your two boys? How do you find the courage to make a devastating situation better or even bearable? This isn't a simple story. There is no happily ever after, no closure. And whatever you do, if you meet Kathy Kelly or her husband Ralph or their daughter Maddie, don't say to them, "I don't know how you do it." Don't say to them, "You know, if it were me, I would be lying in the corner unable to function." I'm glad Kathy told me that, because before I met her, that's exactly what I was going to say. Here's Kathy with her incredible story. You know, it was funny meeting you, and we've just been setting up the cameras and sitting down, and you and I have been gossiping about products that we use to cover our grey routes and what time you've got your car parking meter. And it's like you've lost your two beautiful boys, but your life still has details in it, doesn't it? Like you still have to get your grey routes done.
Absolutely.
And put money in the parking meter.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, life doesn't stop. And that, I think that's the funny thing. People say all sorts of things. You know, most people have got great intention, but they say all sorts of things like, "Oh, I don't know how, you do it. And I couldn't be like that. I'd just be a heap in the corner." Well, I'm a heap in the corner every other day. And there's not a day in the last 5 years that I haven't been crying. And I sat down and watched the footy show last night, which had a piece on our family to promote the Stay Kind Day that we're having on Sunday. And, I just sat there and sobbed by myself, husband in hospital, daughter in another room, didn't want to watch it. And, that is our life. But you do have to get up and you've just got to do everyday things because life doesn't stop. And the only way that does happen is if, you take that into your own hands like Stuart did. So,
is your house a house of grief?
I think I finally realised that it was a bit too sad while Stuart was there. I think the sadness is overwhelming and it's very hard for any of us, but I think as a mother it's really hard for me not to put my grief onto the other children. That's, it doesn't matter how much you shouldn't do that, you just do.
Of course.
And I found myself the last few years getting angry with Madeline and Stuart because they wouldn't acknowledge Thomas. They wouldn't talk about him, and that angered me as a parent. And it's not until you sit down with, a counsellor or a doctor or somebody like that tells you you can't do that. They have to do it in their own time, and you have to be able to pare back and understand that, they have to go about their way of dealing with it and their time will come. But that's very hard to do that.
I've been watching some of your TED Talks and some of the things that you have done, firstly since Thomas died and then since Stuart died. You've started charities, you've raised awareness about drinking, you've worked on campaigns around lockout laws and now around suicide prevention. Is there a sense that you're doing it for them, and what happens when you stop?
Look, you do it for them, but I suppose we started all of, being in the public eye purely by chance because we wanted to fight for Thomas. We wanted to fight for justice. And I think, we were being told at the time by the DPP that we would be lucky to see the person who killed him get between 0 to 2 years behind bars. And we thought, our son was 18. He stepped out of a taxi. There's all sorts of different reports. The offender walked off a wall ahead of Thomas. There was no altercation, there was no discussion, there was no words exchanged. He just walked straight up to Thomas and punched him in the face. So, I think, how can you sit back and see your child lost his life, 70 or 80 years of a life, when it was just starting, and not fight for that? So we just... that's where it starts. And I think, with Rosie and all the other people that you've met and we've met along the way, if you're a parent, there's nothing you wouldn't do for your child. As much as we argue with them, they disagree with us, they think we don't know anything, all of that stuff aside, you would lay your life down for them. And I know that, I remember being in the hospital. It might have just been after we were in the hospital when Thomas died, and Madeline was just 17. And she said to me, I wanted it to be me. And I thought, why would a 17-year-old need to say that? But she saw her brother as, a young man that kind of, he had everything going for him, but he was a bit insecure amongst friends. And she thought, well, I've never had any trouble with friends. She'd had a boyfriend, he'd never had a girlfriend. She'd been invited to parties, he hadn't. And I think she just thought, I've had a life that he hasn't had, so it's not fair. And I think as parents, of course, you would do anything for them. But as far as what we've done since, that drive comes from having to have a purpose. And I think particularly with us, it started with, a sense of injustice, and then that fight and that anger, which then slowly sort of turns around and becomes determination about doing something to drive forward and make a difference. And I think what we found, everybody we spoke to was happy to speak to us. And, we had Andrew Scipione, who was the police commissioner at the time, said to Ralph, one of the first meetings he had, we have a budget of $3.4 billion, the third largest police force in the Western world, and 70% of that is taken up with violence. And then we met Mick Welling, who was head of homicide, still is head of homicide, and he said to Ralph, I wouldn't walk anywhere on a street in Sydney any night of the week after 10 p.m. And I think those two first meetings really made us think, what is wrong? What's happening in society? Yes, there used to be fisticuffs when I was younger and you go out to a bar, but we weren't out drinking the entire evening. There wasn't, hundreds of licences in a small designated area like there was in the Cross. And, of course, the level of intoxication is very different, and there's drugs involved as well. So I think we just felt we had to do something, and so that was how we set up the foundation as a legacy to Tom. We're trying to move away from being an advocate for the lockout laws now, and the only reason I say that is because our foundation is about prevention, it's about values, it's a values-based organisation. And
so it's more about a drinking culture.
It's more about our mission is to make sure our youth are safe. That's as simple as it is, and that has now incorporated with Take Care, but it's also, it just flows so beautifully into Stay Kind because a lot of our youth suicide is due to bullying.
That's something you know a thing or two about.
Yeah.
I mean, only in this day and age could the family of a child that was murdered be the target of death threats. I mean, it breaks my brain that after Thomas's death, people threatened you and your family. Under what possible cause did they do that?
Look, that all stemmed last year because the lockouts were being reviewed. But I think what the average person doesn't understand is that since those since the lockouts, changes to legislation and the various things have come into place since February 2014, there hasn't been a single serious brain injury death at St Vincent's Hospital. And when Thomas was killed in July 2012, there was neurosurgeons on standby every single weekend and facial reconstruction surgeons there every Monday morning putting people back together. And so we went to the hospital and we spoke to Gordian and we said, how many people, could you really even give us an estimate of how many lives that haven't been lost since these changes came into play? And he said 20 to 40, maybe more.
What's it like in a family where one person's way to grieve is to get stuck into a cause and try to make change, and another person's grief might be different and another person's might be different again? How have you managed that since Thomas's death and then again since Stuart's?
It is very hard, and I can honestly say we argue quite a bit about this subject. And, the way my husband Ralph handles his grief is by doing what he's done, and what he's been able to achieve with the foundation in the short time that we've been in operation is quite incredible. So, I'm proud, and I know the kids, I know Stuart was, and I know Madeline is very proud of their father. There's times where I just don't want to do it anymore, and I do say to him, there has to be an exit strategy. How can we continue, particularly now that we've lost Stuart? My primary focus is our daughter. She's all we have left. And so I want her to know that, it's not all about everything else and saving the world and making all these changes. I want her to know that she is our prime focus, and the only way we're going to find happiness again in our lives is through her happiness and through the fact that, one day hopefully she'll meet a nice partner and get married and have children of her own. And
no pressure.
To me, I know, no pressure. She says, Mum, I'm 22. But I do think that...
all our hopes and dreams live with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think at the end of the day, that's where the joy will come again, when we have the opportunity to hopefully have some grandchildren, because there's plenty of dark days. There's plenty of days where you just don't want to do this anymore. But quite frankly, we don't have a choice.
Yeah, that's true. You don't have a choice.
No. And I mean, Stuart made that horrific decision, but at the end of the day, he didn't have the years of maturity that we have. And I looked at him as he was the most extraordinary young man, and he was funny, he was bubbly, he was as Madeline said in an interview the other day, he was our light. He was what gave us the happiness. And to think that
even after Thomas died?
Yeah, he was the one that he was a great joke teller. He was funny. The banter in the house was always because of him. But none of us could really see what he was going through, and we're still trying to get to the bottom of that. But, he was obviously suffering to the point that he just thought that life wasn't worth living anymore. And I guess what I'm getting at is he was a very mature young man for a person of the age of 18, but obviously he didn't have that level of maturity to realise that life would get better if he gave it a chance.
And that sense of permanence. With Thomas, it was just so random and so sudden and so out of the blue. And I imagine, is there a part of you that's like, what if he hadn't gone? What if it had been half an hour? Do you play that game in your head? And what story do you tell yourself about what happened to Thomas, first of all?
Look, I think that the only comfort I have is that I don't think he saw anything coming. And I know that he was pretty well deceased from the moment he was punched. He was knocked out before he would have hit the ground. That was the velocity of the punch. And, it's pretty hard to take when you sit in a courtroom and you hear that the offender didn't kill Thomas, the pavement did. I mean, it's just so ridiculous to hear that scenario.
Was that the defence?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that I guess the only comfort I have is that it was so quick. He was also really happy. He was walking along the street. He was holding a girl's hand.
I've seen the CCTV footage.
Yeah, and he was contemplating
happy.
How he was going to kiss this girl. And I know that for a fact because, once we finally got into his phone, we went through and he had this long conversation backwards and forwards with a mate that he'd seen the previous night, who obviously had a bit more experience than Tom, and was telling him how he should be going about, making this final move on this particular evening. So I guess he was happy, whereas Stuart, on the other hand, was obviously struggling and as much as we were concerned about him, there wasn't ever a moment that we ever would have thought that he would have taken his life.
With the wisdom of hindsight, can you see things that you didn't at the time?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, look, Stuart had an incredible year 12 in 2015. He was the head of the largest boarding house at the King's School. He was a school monitor, so there's a cohort of about 225 boys and only 25 were selected. And, you know, I say this with absolute admiration for him. You know, he wasn't a goody two-shoes. He wasn't one of these boys that got into all these roles because he was, you know, look, I think he was a great leader. I really do think that. And he was very popular and he had a lot of friends at school. But he showed great leadership skills. You know, to stand outside the court that day, he contacted me after the Crown appeal was heard. The kids weren't there that day. And he rang me from boarding school and said, Mum, when will there be a decision? I said, look, I don't know. It could be tomorrow. It could be 3 months from now. He said, I want to speak to the press. And I said, look, I'm not sure if that's a very good idea, but let's talk with Dad about it when you come home on the weekend from school and we'll work it out from there. But, you know, we all want to protect you. And he said, well, this will be my last opportunity, won't it? And I said, probably.
Up until now, I haven't said anything as I was too young. I've just tried to block it out. I've tried to understand over and over why, at such a young age, my brother lost his life so tragically, but I have no answers. I want Thomas's short life to have some meaning in his death, so we can see change, a new, fresh start. One where I believe we should have respect for one another, for our friends, family, acquaintances, different cultures and complete strangers. I want to see the values in relationships where having fun with friends on a night out means just that, existing without the need for excessive drinking, where any violence is totally unacceptable in our society.
Little did we know we would end up at the High Court, but he did say, this is my last opportunity. He was 16 at the time, and, you know, when Thomas died when Stuart was only 14, he was a little boy. And so I think he really felt that he needed to stand up and take a stand.
While he had people's attention.
Absolutely.
Was it a difficult decision to be in court, and were you all in court together?
Look, Ralph and I went to every single hearing that we could, and we didn't need to be there for any of them. But we went because we were there for Thomas. Both the children didn't come to the sentencing hearing, which is the mini sort of trial, and they didn't come to the Crown appeal, but they were there at both the decisions. So when judgment was passed, and so I'm glad they weren't at the sentencing hearing. I'm glad they didn't have to sit there and hear things that had happened to Thomas. I'm glad they didn't have to sit there and listen to 20 or 30 glowing character references of the offender when our victim impact statements weren't taken into account for sentencing.
What?
So victim impact statements, that's one of the things that has changed since Thomas's case. That now the magistrate can take those victim impact statements into account when he's passing sentence. But when we went through the court system,
he just got to have good references.
He was allowed to have good references. We were allowed to read out our victim impact statements, but they weren't allowed to be taken into account. So we heard all about how he was only 18 and how he had 60 or 70 years ahead of him and how he should be given the maximum discount because he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. Mind you, that was almost 12 months after he killed Thomas, and that he was taking, you know, aggression courses in prison and doing all the right things. You know, it was all what you're supposed to say. And I guess we found with the justice system that it wasn't a justice system. It was all about getting the offender as little possible time incarcerated as possible, because at the end of the day it all boils down to money. Even we didn't even get a trial because he pleaded guilty. Yet there's been similar cases to Thomas's that have had, you know, 3-4 weeks in court. But because he pleaded guilty, and that's the ultimate aim, is to get them to plead guilty.
Did you want him to plead guilty?
Not to manslaughter.
You wanted him to be tried for murder?
Absolutely.
Kathy, how do you sit in court within how far from this person?
Close enough, but as close as we're sitting now, I was next to his mother. There was no control over that.
So like a metre and a half away from his mother. Did you ever lock eyes?
No. And, you know, just little things that really aren't that important. But I remember walking into that courthouse that day. It was a little old tiny part of the Supreme Court, you know, and I know that they can't, there's so many cases that they can't all be in the main Supreme Court building. But, you know, those are the sorts of things that need to be fixed. You know, we should never have had to be in a position where we had to be that close to his, you know, his friends and people like that.
Did anyone from his family ever apologise to you?
No.
Never spoke to you?
No.
Sat near you in the court every day and said nothing?
No. And on that particular day that we walked into that court hearing, I was walking around the corner with a girlfriend who was supporting us through the case. And I remember, you know, you're in a very strange place walking into something like that. So we were joking about something, walking around the corner. And I remember that afternoon the media had these huge photos of his mother crying in her hands and me laughing. I mean, what did I have to laugh about? My son was dead. But I was just trying to alleviate the pressure of the moment, the nerves of walking in there and what were we going to face that day. And that's how the media decided to portray me that day. And, you know, and it's not about me. At the end of the day, everything has been about the boys. It's not about what we've lost. It's about what they've lost. But it still affects the family that's left behind. And the same with what Ralph went through with the media last year. You know, everything was above board. He was taking a salary. It was all approved by our board. The man's been working 7 days a week, 7 nights a week since Thomas died. And his business went down the gurgler. We were almost bankrupt. And everything that he was taking at that time was nowhere near what he should have been earning. And people earn money that run charities. How do they do it otherwise?
How have we
he has
lost our
never taken a
compassion?
cent since that time last year. And then on top of that, because of all that media, we really believe that is why Stuart isn't here today. Because Stuart saw everything. Our kids aren't stupid. You know, they're technologically savvy. They were seeing, he was quoting comments. Stuart was being ridiculed. I was being ridiculed. They were calling Stuart a puppet because he got up and he took a stand in front of 750 people at our dinner. Now, if none of that had have happened to Ralph last year, Stuart would be alive today. And then he spent less than 24 hours at a college at Sydney University and he came out of there a broken human being.
What do you think happened in those 24 hours?
You know, it's still under investigation, so it's difficult to talk about it, and we don't have the facts. But I know, I know
as a mother,
something happened to
and he
Stuart
would never
that
talk
night.
about it.
He never spoke about it.
What story do you tell yourself about all of this? About losing 2 sons in such incredibly unfair circumstances?
I don't know, it's pretty hard not to sit back and say why and what did we do. You know, I was talking to a friend on the way in here this afternoon and I said to her, God hates me. Now my husband's in hospital with pneumonia. I mean, what on earth is? What else can go? Like you don't even
have
want
black humour.
You don't even want to say what else can go wrong.
Yeah.
So I think I don't know. There's plenty of days I don't really want to be here, but I am, and you just have to keep going. We have to for Madeline. In the same way she feels like that about us. I think she said on the 60 Minutes interview, which was incredibly proud of her to do that because she's made it very clear she doesn't want to be the centre of attention. She doesn't want people knowing who she is. And, you know, for her to sit there and say to Ali Langdon,
Mum and Dad deserve to see one of their children go up. I mean, they're my strength. They're the reason I want to get out of bed every day and keep going.
I mean, it was just so heartbreaking to hear that. And I know that we are her strength and she's ours.
I don't know what your belief system is, but do you believe that Stuart and Thomas are together in some way?
I hope so. I really do. You know, I grew up as a Catholic. I have a fairly, my kids and my husband haven't been terribly good believers. I tried, but kind of failed there, I think. And, you know, Stuart would be one that would always say to me, Mum, it's scientifically proven there is no such thing, you know, it's evolution, this is how it all works, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, and that's why I can say, hand on heart, that he did not take his life because he wanted to be with his brother. He did this because he just felt there was just no hope that he was ever going to have a normal life. But I would love to think that they're together. That's my only comfort, that they are together, and that hopefully one day we'll have the opportunity to be with them again as well.
I wanted to ask you also, the circumstances around how they died were so different in a lot of ways. With Thomas, you had a couple of days to spend with him in hospital while he was still hooked up to machines, basically. I listened to a TED talk that you gave, and you talked about being in mother mode, and you were making sure everyone else was okay, and calling people and making sure the dogs and the pets were being looked after at home. What's your memory of those couple of days now?
I think the time in the hospital is quite vivid, really. I've got a pretty good memory in relation to things like terminologies that were being used about Thomas and things like that, whereas I think Ralph remembers very different things. I guess that's how men and women are quite wired differently.
What do you remember?
Oh, look, I remember them talking about his ICP levels, which was his intracranial pressure. So when we were first taken up to the ICU, a young neurosurgeon came out and spoke to us, and she basically said that, she didn't feel that there was much hope, but we didn't really. You don't really quite grasp what they're saying, and you kind of think, oh well, But she said he's very strong, and the emergency doctor had said the same thing. But they said that they'd be settling him, and then we could go in about 20 minutes. Well, we were sitting there for about 2 or 3 hours before we went in, and what had happened was his intracranial pressure following the surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain had risen to 65, and a normal intracranial pressure like yours and mine is about 4. So if it gets beyond 20, then usually there would be irreversible brain damage if the brain was still alive. So when Ralph and I finally went in to see him, we were told that it needed to be around 20, but nobody really explained to us that there would have already been brain damage or that his brain had already died. And I just remember we sat there from 4 o'clock when we first saw him through till when the doctor came on at 9 the next morning and took us aside and told us that she believed he was brain dead. I remember looking at that machine for hours. We were willing it to go down to 20. And so it was sort of sitting around the 40 mark by the time we got in to see him. And then I remember it did get down close to the low 20s, and it shot back up again, and then it went back down, and eventually it did sort of settle around 20. So we thought he was going to be okay because we hadn't had any real explanation at that point. But I think the whole time that we were in the ICU, and we really, other than running around and looking after people, we didn't really leave him at any time. We never left that floor, and until he had passed away. And I remember Ralph would say to me that he truly believed that he was just begging Thomas to fight. But I think I knew the moment I saw him that he was already gone.
Did he look different to you?
Yeah, his eyes were fixed. His eyes were open. They kept trying to close them. I said, no, don't. He sleeps like that. He's weird
Did
a weird kid. He often be in the back seat of the car, sound asleep, snoring with his eyes wide open.
So that wasn't unusual to see?
No, but, he was so cold. They had him at a certain temperature, and there wasn't a lot to see as far as any injuries go, other than the fact that they, had shaved his hair for the operation, and there was bandages saying no bone, and there was a little bit of blood in his hair.
Because they'd had to remove part of his skull
yeah,
to relieve the pressure.
Yeah.
Among the incredible things that have come out of this horrific tragedy, you donated Thomas's organs.
That was a very difficult decision for me. It shouldn't have been, but it was. I remember standing, the kids came up from Barrel. My sister and some friends of hers drove her down to Barrel and picked up. My mother was living down there at the time, so picked up my mum and our kids. She didn't know what was going to happen to Thomas. I didn't tell her. And brought them to the hospital, and Madeline arrived with all her study notes because she was about to sit her trials for the HSC, and she was quite annoyed when she got to the hospital, like, what am I doing here? You know, I've got my trials coming up.
Bloody Thomas, got in a fight. I mean, my God.
I know. So they just had no idea. And within seconds of arriving at the hospital, they were told he was going to die. And I remember going through that decision process, and the four of us stood together in a room. And
how's it brought up with you?
How was it?
Yeah.
Look, there was a an organ donation sort of counsellor there, who it's an awful thing to say, but I couldn't stand her. But it's a really dreadful thing to say, but it's all about getting the organs, and I know that that's really important. But at the time. And I think that's what's really wrong with organ donation in our country. And I don't believe that we should be able, this is just a personal opinion, I don't think we should be able to interfere as parents or as family loved ones. If somebody signs and says that they want to donate their organs, that should be the final
Which
result.
Thomas has.
Which he had
done before.
Yeah. And the only reason, I sort of knew about that, or Ralph knew about it, is because he took him to get his driver's licence, and at that point it was still on your licence. And Ralph said to me, I remember sitting down with him and he's saying, oh, well, this isn't going to happen, Dad, but, what boxes should I tick?
And a lot of people are very surprised that families can override. Are you saying that you didn't want to have to make that choice, you just wanted it taken out of your hands because he'd already made that choice?
No, I
what
think
you
for
mean?
me, look, the kids, Madeline and Stuart actually agreed with Ralph, and the three of them said that they felt that we should do it. And I was really distressed at the time, and I didn't want them to touch him.
Of course.
So that was the only reason. It wasn't because I wanted to be selfish,
Of course.
but I just didn't want them to touch him. And I've since read all the documentation from his autopsy, and to read that as a mother is just, it's awful. And I didn't have to read it, but I wanted to be informed. I wanted to know everything about everything that had taken place, because I didn't want anything to be out of my control that could be in my control. And, just
you didn't want to be surprised by information that you didn't know.
And I probably shouldn't have read it, but I just remember reading, he had like a 63 centimetre incision from the base of his throat to his pubic bone, where they did the organ donation. And I remember hearing about his weight, which was obviously a lot lighter because they'd already taken his organs.
What organs did they donate? Did you
They
donate?
couldn't use his heart, although they kept the valves which can save babies down the track. I was really angry about that. And the reason they couldn't use his heart was because they wouldn't declare him brain dead without a CT scan, and they didn't want to move him because they said he would die whilst they moved him, and they didn't want him not to be with us when he died. So I wasn't
Kathy.
angry with the hospital, but I was angry that there was a beautiful, healthy 18-year-old heart in an 18-year-old young man who was as fit and healthy. And to me, that seemed like a waste. I just felt like if we're going to donate his organs,
technicality.
it was just a technicality. So we donated his lungs and his kidneys and I think his pancreas and the heart valves. But he was very specific on his licence. He said that they couldn't have his skin or his eyes. And, that was really important to grant him that. And when Stuart died, I remember the coroner's office did contact us, and because he died of suicide, you can't obviously donate organs, but they asked if they could have his eyes, and I said no. And I don't feel guilty about that. I feel a bit sad, but I feel like we gave enough.
Kathy, there's no one who should feel less guilt than you in the world. You have given everything. You've given so much.
And look, I think one of the things that, we run a safe space in the city, and I don't know if you know much about that, but we have 3 safe spaces at the moment, one in Town Hall, one in Darling Harbour and one at King's Cross. And they run every Friday and Saturday night from 10 p.m. till 4 a.m. And we pay the St John's ambulance to run those spaces, but the rest of it is predominantly run with trained volunteers.
And what happens in those safe spaces? What are they for?
So we have, they are split into teams and they take rotational turns where they are walking along various areas of the Sydney looking out for predominantly vulnerable youth, whether they're intoxicated or whether they just need help. We help anybody. They don't have to be young, but, they can be just seeking directions. A lot of overseas tourists that arrive and think they're going to get accommodation on Saturday night and they've got nowhere to go. But a lot of intoxicated people, people who have been affected by drugs. Girls walking on the street with their shoes in their hands. We hand out thongs, we hand out water to hydrate people. And these volunteers do this from 10 till 4, right through the night. We have a young man who's just, I'm not even sure if he's 19 and a half or whatever now, but from the moment he turned 18, he said he was sitting at home having a few beers thinking, what am I doing with my life? He saw about the program. He came on board. He's worked every Friday and Saturday night since. He's just done 150 nights. And they do that just because they want to get out and make a difference in the community. And you can imagine in winter, it's damn cold. And they are going out and they're looking for intoxicated people. They also bring people back to the safe space, which is a tented area. Kids can come in there. They don't have to be drunk. They can charge their phones, help with communication to get them home safely. So I guess what we look at it as sliding door moments, that there are so many parents that don't realise we've helped their kids get home. And in the just over 2 years that we've been running this program, we've had 45,000 interventions. So we are saving lives without a doubt.
How can people help?
Look, they can get on board and volunteer if they want. They can throw money at the safe space so we can continue to operate it. We've had almost 3 years of funding. That runs out in July next year. So we have several partners involved, City of Sydney, the state government, Crown Casino, which is not really the casino, it's the Packer Family Foundation. They put money aside to help with charities, and also Macquarie Bank. So we'll be looking at refunding those next year. We also want to continue to expand that program. We'd love to see it around the country.
What a fantastic program.
So that's one of our main things, and we call that the Take Care Safe Space, spelt with a K, with Thomas's initials.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I guess that Ralph said to me one day, we walked out of the Attorney General's department and he said, if we do nothing else, this is something we can be proud of. And so if I just go back to when we lost Thomas, Ralph couldn't work. He had his own business and it's just impossible to function. But the bills keep coming in. You know, we had a nice house in the Southern Highlands. We had cars that were leased, but you just can't get rid of the debt. You know, you can't sell the cars because they're not worth as much as what you owe on them. We had a mortgage. We had a house on the market for 4 years. It took us to sell that house. And, you know, I guess what I'm saying is you not only are emotionally and physically and mentally drained, but you're financially drained as well. And it even came down to the point where I'd be ringing the council to say, you know, could you give us an extension on our rates because we can't pay them. And the first time somebody was very accommodating, and I think the second time I had to ring the person on the end of the phone said, look, we've already helped you before, we're not helping you again. And the worst thing was when Ralph rang the taxation department. He had a very substantial tax debt, and he said, I'm not ringing to not pay it, I just need some help. I need some way of working out a plan so that this can be done. And the person on the end of the phone said, I don't care if your son's dead. You have to pay your taxes. So what came out of that, we were talking to a neighbour of ours who was a farmer, and he said, I don't understand why they can't help in some way people that have been through homicide or domestic violence or whatever. Why can't the banks maybe give them a special rate like farmers get? And my husband said, you know, I didn't know that was the case. So we went to Brad Hazzard, who was the Attorney General at the time. He really liked the idea. And when he was moved on to another area, Gabrielle Upton contacted us. We thought we'd have to, here we go again, we've got to do this all over again. But she actually contacted us and said she really liked the idea. And what Brad had done, he had gone off to all the banks. He'd written to various councils and anywhere that was a debt. And then Gabrielle put the whole thing in to play. And in March, I think it was March last year, they brought out a financial hardship package. And so I think there's about 80,000 people that could be involved in that package. I think in the first year they've helped about 3,000 to 5,000 people. And really what it is, it's a program that gets somebody else to make all those phone calls on your behalf. So that's an incredible help to people who are suffering, and just will give them a chance to get back on their feet. And that's something we found we didn't have. So if if we do nothing else.
Well, if no, you do nothing else. It's like you've done so many things. That's yet another legacy.
Yeah, so we're really proud of that.
Yeah.
And hopefully, that gives people that chance to get back on their feet.
Just finally, I wanted to ask you, how is your grief around Thomas different to your grief around Stuart? And do they manifest in different ways for you?
Absolutely, I think they do. I'm so heartbroken with Stuart. Not that I'm not heartbroken about losing Thomas, but it's impossible not to feel that we failed him, that we didn't see this coming. And so even though I spoke about when he went off to uni and something happened, we brought him home less than 24 hours after being in that place. And he went into his room for the next 2 to 3 months and we could not get him to come out. So we knew he was depressed then. I guess there would have always been a certain level of concern that something horrific could happen like suicide, but it hadn't crossed our mind. But slowly he began to come out. We went to see a leading psychiatrist with Headspace. We didn't take him. There's no way. You can't just drag an 18-year-old kid along with you. That he was bigger and stronger than us.
And he didn't want to go.
And he said there was nothing wrong with him, but he just didn't want to talk about it. So we went and saw this particular professor, and I remember her saying, from what we told her, that she said that he was severely clinically depressed and that we needed to do something. I guess had she made it a little bit more urgent, I'm not trying to blame her, but had she said to us,
she didn't use the word suicide.
No, if she had have said to us, you need to get him seen, whether it's by force or whatever, we would have done anything. But, again, there didn't seem to be any urgency. And eventually she did say, try and get him a little job, don't force him and make it limited. So we ended up Ralph helped him get a job at Royal North Shore Hospital. He was working in the storeroom, unpacking boxes. He said he hated it, but it was great money, so he was happy to just keep going. And then he got a job out at the King's School training a rugby team, which he loved. But as he started to come out and come good again and was doing all of that and things seemed quite normal, he kept asking us if he could go overseas and start his life again. And it wasn't until recently that Ralph said to me, I just don't he said to me, he's not coming back if we send him. And the kids have British passports because their father was born over there. And I think we just didn't feel that he was ready to go. We were worried about him at a certain level, but also we did look into it. He was accepted into a university in the UK. He really wanted to go, and we looked at the cost and we just didn't have the money. And so I think the ultimate decision-making for him was that last month or that last few weeks, and we said, we just can't let you go yet, Stuart. And he probably just thought, well, what's the point? He said, I can never be me in this country. I will always be branded with the lockout laws and Thomas's name. I will never be just Stuart Kelly. And I think that's terribly sad that he felt that there was no way out of this. But I think definitely the grief is more raw for Stuart at the moment. In fact, the other day was Thomas's 5th anniversary of his death, or was 2 days prior, so it was the 5th anniversary of the day that he was hit and the day our lives changed. And I actually didn't think about the date, and Ralph said, let's go out and have lunch together. He was going out of the area on business for the day, and he wanted me to go with him. I said, what do you want me to go? I don't want to go there. What do you want me to come with you for? He said, because it's Thomas's anniversary today. And so I guess the rawness of Stuart has made... It's an awful thing to say, but it almost seems like some of my memories with Thomas have sort of paled into insignificance, and I feel really sad about that because I don't ever want to forget him. And when I talk to the boys every night before I go to sleep. I guess that's my way of praying. I used to pray, and now I don't really pray anymore, but because I don't know what I believe anymore. But I talk to the boys, and I often feel all guilty because I don't know whether I've said enough to Thomas before I talk to Stuart. And do I talk to Thomas first because he's been gone the longest or because he's the eldest? It's just so ridiculous.
So even after death, you're worried about favourites. Aren't mothers funny?
That's exactly, that's funny. I've never thought about it like that, but that's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah.
And, you know,
You're still their mum.
they're, you know, I think this is a thing that a lot of people don't know. I mean, they know that Stuart was 18, they know Tom was 18. And I don't know whether this was part of Stuart's decision making, but Stuart was exactly 7 days older than Thomas when he took his life.
Stuart was.
Yes, they were both 18 and a half and 3 days and 10 days. And I just think, how could he not have thought about that? So I think that's the most heartbreaking part of the grief, just knowing that he was really suffering, and as parents, we didn't see it. As parents, we don't listen to what our kids are saying. And really, it doesn't matter why they feel away, but we need to find out how they feel. And if that means, even if it's once a week, sitting down, turning the phones off and having dinner together. You know, I know we're in an apartment at the moment and we sit in front of the TV. You know, that's not that's not family. That's not communicating. And then the kids go off to their bedrooms because they watch everything on their laptops.
Yeah.
So I think as parents, you know, it's an awful thing to say, but I think we fail our kids. We don't listen. And when Ralph got sick in the last few weeks, he was chatting to the doctor and the doctor said, you know, I can't tell you how many people bring their kids in here that are suffering of some kind of depression or that. And I ask the kids a question and the parents jump in and answer it. And I don't know about you, but I know I did that every time I took my kids to the doctor. So we're not letting them speak. We're not giving them a voice. And then on top of that, kids don't want to burden their parents because they see the pressure that parents are under, so they don't want to tell them anything else. So we have to go back to basics. We have to fix this because we can't have the biggest killer of our youth in this country being suicide. We just can't.
Kathy, thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you've done and that you're still doing. You know, your family is extraordinary. Please send all my love to Maddie as well.
I will. Thank you so much.
I've not met her, but she seems like an extraordinary woman.
Yeah, look, she's...
who must have very broad shoulders, as you all do.
I think she does. And we're very proud of her. She's just about to finish uni this year. So going through the HSC with a brother dying and then 5 years of law, and she's just about to come out, and she wants to be a criminal lawyer of all things. She wants to change the way things are done. And, yeah, she's an incredible young woman.
Thanks for listening to No Filter. If you'd like to find out more about the Thomas Kelly Youth Foundation, please go to thomaskellyouthfoundation.org.au. You can donate money, volunteer for them, or just help Kathy and Ralph spread the word. If you or a loved one is struggling with mental health, we urge you to contact Lifeline on 131114. Before I let you go though, here's another podcast I thought you might like.
Hi, I'm Corinne Grant, and I've been talking to some extraordinary people for a new Mamma Mia podcast called Fighting for Fair. They've all faced unimaginable battles, and their stories will make you cry, laugh, and cry again. You will hear Australians from all walks of life telling their stories. They all have one thing in common. They're fighting for a world that gives everyone a fair go, and they are not giving up. Fighting for Fair. True stories of social justice from around Australia. Subscribe in iTunes or the Mamma Mia podcast app. Out now.
If you want all of our podcasts in one place, download the Mamma Mia podcast app. You can also find our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to help us continue to make this podcast, make it more often, make others like it, please spread the word. Please tell someone about this show or any of our podcasts. Please share it. Please post about it on your Facebook page. Please, next time you're out with a girlfriend or visiting your mum or your daughter, please download our podcast app onto their phone and show them how podcasts work, because people who are into podcasts are really into them, but there are a lot of people who don't know about them yet. So please, sharing is caring. If you want to suggest a guest or just ask me a question, call the pod phone on 02 8999 9386 or flick me an email at podcast@mamamia.com.au. I also want to thank Kathy for coming and telling her story. I've always said that the biggest gift women can give each other is by being honest about our struggles, even when they're brutal, even when they aren't resolved, even when there is no happy ending. Today's show was produced by Eliza Ratliff for the Mamma Mia Women's Network. The executive producer of podcasts is Monique Bowley, and the head of entertainment is Holly Wainwright. I'm Mia Friedman, and I will see you next week.